Good morning and welcome members and the public to the third meeting in 2013 of the Health and Sport Committee, and as usual at this point can I remind you to switch off all mobile phones, Blackberries and other wireless devices as they can often interfere with our sound system. We have apologies today from Aileen McLeod and Drew Smith, who are not able to be with us, and can I welcome Richard Lyle, who's here as a substitute. Welcome, Richard. Before we go to the first item, I think it would be useful just to introduce ourselves as we go round to this morning. My name is Duncan McNeill. I'm the MSP for York and Inverclyde and convener of the Health and Sport Committee. Professor David.
I'm Professor David Newby, British Heart Foundation, Professor of Cardiology here in Edinburgh.
Bob Doris, MSP for Glasgow and Deputy Convener of the Committee.
I'm Keith Fox, Professor of Cardiology, also here in Edinburgh.
Richard Simpson, I'm MSP for Mid-Scotland and Fife.
I'm Tim Goodship, I'm Professor of Renal Medicine from Newcastle.
Gil Patterson, MSP for Claybank and Mulgai.
Nancy Gregg, Network Development Officer for Health and Social Care Alliance Scotland.
Mark MacDonald, MSP for North East Scotland.
George Grindley, Lead Facilitator for Angus Long-Term Condition Support Groups, and I'm also an Executive Director of the Alliance.
Nanette Milne, MSP for North East Scotland.
Ian McCarthy, Secretary of AHUS UK.
David Torrance, MSP, Kirkcaldy Constituency.
Ben Woodward, Trustee of AS UK.
Richard Lyle, MSP, Central Region.
Thank you all for that. Now with the formalities over, can we move to our first question in this round table from Richard Simpson, please.
As you know, this committee has been investigating this area for some time. Indeed, we did so in the last Parliament as well, which resulted in the changes creating the IPTR system. The two areas are obviously the SMC and the IPTR. And since we started it, of course, there have been the announcements of the Rutledge, Scott and Swainson reviews of the whole process. So we're in a sort of iterative process in which things are already changing and appear to be changing. And the most recent thing has been the announcement of £21 million for orphan medicines. So the question I want to ask the panel today is, what do you hope to get out of the reviews by Rutledge, Scott and Swainson that will take us further down the line of creating a robust, fair, transparent system that doesn't have postcode lottery in it? What would you like to see out of the review? What revisions to the system?
Anyone want to take?
If I may start, I think one of the key guiding principles is that there is evidence that's applied locally, evidence based on the risk and the risk-benefit balance for the individuals. And if we have a consistent way of applying that, then that can be interpreted locally, but it can avoid some of the problems that we've had in the past.
Any other quick comments on that? Response to Richard? Ms. Gregg?
Yes, I should mention the Health and Social Care Alliance hasn't thus far been invited to contribute to the Scottish Government's ongoing review of new medicines, and we have written now to both Professor Philip Rutledge and Professor Charles Swainson to offer assistance with both sections of the review. We'd be interested to see how the findings of this inquiry will feed into the Government's review and vice versa.
Okay. Anyone else? Yes, please. Professor Godge.
It's an interest in a very rare kidney disease. What I'd like to see anywhere is a rapid, transparent, equitable process by which patients, if they are proven to have a disease for which there is an effective treatment, can rapidly get access to that treatment, because some of these diseases need to be treated as soon as possible.
And anyone else? No?
Can I come
yes,
back
follow up.
To ask some specific questions, really raising from the Alliance paper. Comment from an Alliance member. Consultants actively discourage individual patient treatment requests. Patients were also told to make an IPTR which was refused would not be looked on favourably in the future. So, you know, one of the concerns seems to be that consultants are not actually, don't feel the IPTR system as we've got it is actually functioning adequately. And then the other thing is that it should be very rapid, because many of these patients are in a late stage of their illness, and it's the new drug that might just give them an extension. So, but, you know, so we've got some consultants present. Are they aware of this amongst colleagues, that people are either discouraged or they in turn discourage patients because the system doesn't work properly? Or?
I would disagree. I mean, I think that it is possible to use the system. It's cumbersome, but it has been possible to use it.
Have you got some experience of that?
Yes. I mean, in particular instances, for example, where there are new treatments and for which the old treatments have failed, then there is a real case where it can be justified to consider the new treatment under the IPTR.
Is that a common experience?
I think so. I think it can be used and has been used appropriately. I think for me some of the disconnect is often when we have treatments that are on international guidelines, treatments that are endorsed by SMC and by NICE, and yet they're still not being used in the clinic, or they're being used in a variable manner. I think that for me is the big issue.
Why would that be?
Usually because of local decision making over drug budgets.
I wonder if Professor Newby would actually...
I was going to let Professor Goodchip respond to your original question. I'll let you back in, Gil, but I'm just wanting to let the witnesses respond. Professor Goodchip?
So my experience for treating a rare disease I'm interested in is that there are 2 patients in Scotland who have been successfully treated with eculizumab under the IPTR system. When that worked, it's worked really well. So it was one particular patient who was given approval to use this drug within 24 hours and has made a dramatic response to that. What is difficult is the variability of the application process. So it does vary from IPTR to IPTR. So it's that I think my colleagues sometimes find a difficulty with.
Okay. Bob and then Gil. Oh, sorry, I've got another one.
Sure, yes, of course.
Mr. Grindley?
I think consultants do appreciate the IPTR, but it is a large, cumbersome document, as you've already identified, that does take a lot of time away from clinical experience, because they've got to go through a large committee at local level, then they've got to go to the pharmacist, and it's a long drag through for a consultant to take away from his clinical time. And I think that's possibly why it's not being used effectively.
Do any of the other witnesses wish to comment on the general view? Yes, please.
Observing the scene in Scotland, we were very interested in the Health Secretary's award of the 20 million for IPTR, and his comment that it's only right that Scottish patients with rare conditions should have access to innovative medicines which are justified and that they're not disadvantaged due to the high cost of these treatments. 4 days later, he said he would issue guidance to the health boards that clinicians should be allowed to prescribe a certain drug and ensure that the IPTR process does not present a barrier to accessing it. What concerned me about that was the admission by the Health Secretary that the IPTR system was a barrier, and that he was able to override the entire system for the sake of one drug.
Anyone else from the witnesses?
I think it's just worth noting that many of the staff and volunteers from the third sector organisations that we spoke to in our engagement exercise didn't know what an IPTR was. And they simply had the perception that some consultants find it easier to access off-licence medicines than others without understanding quite how that process operates. So if members of the public don't know that the system is there, you know, how can it possibly be used effectively?
Bob, and then... Yes? Mr. Woodward?
One person who, with AHUS, who should be doing an IPTR, but has been put off doing it because of the difficulty for her and her clinician. And as a small charity, we're struggling to find resource to be able to help people like that in the process because they can't do it individually.
Okay. Bob.
Okay, thank you.
Then Gavin.
Now, I think it's important we maximise the time you get to speak rather than the MSP, so if you need to come in, do just let us know that. Having spoken to many people within this committee, but also you know, interest groups do contact you as an individual MSP when they're aware of the inquiry going on. One of the things that's been kind of quite clear to myself has been there seems to be a lack of understanding about what IPTRs are actually for. And if I could elaborate a little bit on that and see if any of this chimes with yourself. In some parts of the country, there's almost a conveyor belt of IPTRs. You can't get this medicine, do an IPTR automatically. My understanding is it was never designed for that. It was for individual patient treatment requests where you could show evidence of, specialist evidence of, where the patient would have a benefit over and above the peer group. Back to that exceptionality case. So does anyone around this table think that's been lost somewhere down the line, where IPTRs have been used as an automatic process in some parts of the country to get a drug that otherwise wouldn't be approved, and in other parts of the country people are more selective because they realise the exceptionality argument, and do we have to reinforce what IPTRs are actually for in the first place?
Any responders? Mr. Goodsham.
For a rare disease, it's almost by definition every one of these patients is going to be exceptional. So to compare them with their pair group is almost nonsensical. In Scotland, you will have 3 patients a year presenting with atypical HUS. I would say every one of those is exceptional. But if you compare with them with their pair group, they wouldn't be exceptional.
Anyone else?
As an individual, it's very difficult to find out from any health board site what an IPTR is. You're quite right. It's difficult for the layperson to understand how, why, where, what they can get an IPTR and how it's supported and what it's physically for. Because some websites, it's quite hidden.
Professor Newby?
I was just going to comment that I'm personally not aware where it's been routinely abused, if that's the question that's being posed. I think I've used it, but in very selected cases, exceptional cases, and I'm not aware within my realm that it's been abused in terms of being used as a routine. That's not to say it might happen in certain areas, but I'm certainly not personally aware of it.
Just simply because you've used the expression abused there, I think for clarity, I was making the point that I think we've seen evidence in some parts of the country it's used far more frequently than other parts of the country, and I wouldn't say that's an abuse in the slightest. I would say that some parts of the country may have a different perception of what the purpose of an IPTR is for to other parts of the country, and that's what I'm trying to dig beneath the surface of.
I think it's fair to say that even amongst consultants, there is not complete clarity of information. So people who've used it and gone through the system know how it works, but not every consultant does, and they're put off by the process.
Okay, that's helpful.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to mention that I found out recently, because preparing for this meeting, that the drug that we are particularly interested in is being used for another form of disease. And in fact, I found that the IPTR process for that particular disease has been quite successful because it's defined by a specific genetic defect. And it's no less applicable to our particular disease, where a specific genetic defect determines your place in your cohort.
It just strikes me, I'm wondering, 14 area drug and treatment committees, if I've got the terminology correct, but across the health boards, and we're trying to make IPTRs more appropriate. We're trying to make sure that approvals are more speedy when they're being processed. Do we need 14? Is there a way of streamlining that and making the system more effective? No takers?
Yes, Professor.
My suggestion would be for very rare diseases, such as the one that I'm interested in, that it would make more sense to have one body dealing with particular applications for that drug in that disease, where the expertise can be readily accessed. When you have 14 different committees, they may not have the expertise to actually make a judgment on a particular rare disease and a drug that is applicable to that. So I would look for less number of committees dealing with the rare disease.
Would there be less numbers if every, you know, I may be picking you up wrong, but if there was a committee for each particular disease or each particular, you're not suggesting that, are you?
No. What I'm suggesting is that particularly you put particular diseases, you keep the committees, but perhaps one committee is responsible for a variety of diseases where they keep that expertise.
Mm-hmm. But there is, you know, in terms of the evidence we've had and my own constituency experience, there is a general issue as it applies from to rare diseases as there not, and that the expertise and people who would be in a situation to judge whether that would not be experts themselves, it would be the expert that would be supporting the application and the generalist, if you like, if I can use that term, discussing whether there was merit. Is that an issue? I don't know how you would overcome that, though, but maybe you have your opportunity here today to maybe discuss some of those areas. Yes, and then you, Mr. Grindle.
I think by definition, this is going to involve new therapies where most people are not going to be familiar with the treatments. So the best judgment that we can get is having an informed committee and recognizing the context and where the existing treatments may not work. So what I would call for is, yes, better expertise and an expedited process.
Okay, Mr. Grindley.
Taken from NHS Tayside's website, their IPTR for the clinician is 6 pages long for a clinician to fill in. That then goes to the principal pharmacist or the pharmacist of the clinical area, which is passed on then to the decision-making panel, which is constituted of members that include the Associate Medical Director, Lead Specialty Consultant, a Lead GP, a Lead or Principal Clinical Pharmacist, Clinical Service Manager, Head of Patient Care and Nursing, and they will either approve or not approve an IPTR. That's the process that is in NHST, we assume is Scotland-wide.
Is there any other comments before Bobby, you finish? We'll move to Gil, or do you want to?
I'll move back in later.
Yes, absolutely. Gil.
I wanted to raise the same point that Bob did on the 14 boards, but I'll maybe come back to that when I just follow up on the question from Mr. Grindley. I noted someone said difficulties. I think that was Mr. Woodward, and somebody said cumbersome. And so cumbersome sounds like what I hear from yourself. But is there anything in that process, no matter who it is that's making the decision, is there a need to make all these decisions? Perhaps maybe taking all these decisions together in some fashion that would truncate the system a bit better, bring it together a bit. But I've no idea how long that process takes. So, that would be my question. How do we try and overcome the barriers? I know that everybody that's been here, even people who are critical of the system at some point, always point out that SMCs, the way that we handle that is really, really good, but then it falls down somewhere down the line. So how do we improve it, and how do we address some of the points that you raise here?
Reading the document that's the IPTR from NHS Tayside, before it's actually submitted, the consultant has got to make tenuous figures, like they're asking for treatment cost, an annual cost, anticipated duration of treatment, dose strength, form and frequency of the medication. Reason for the request is a continuance of medicine initiated in primary care? Will the treatment continue only in hospital, hospital and then primary care, previous treatments? It is a cumbersome document, but the content of it, because they are the expert providing the information to the committee, I don't think it can be shortened, but it is very, very cumbersome in its present state. And I don't know how it can be shortened.
Yes, Mr. Woodward.
I've had experience of actually submitting the English equivalent of an IPTR and presented to the local pharmacist, lead pharmacist, a case for Kirimsab. It took me 2 days to write 2 pages to get the essence of what was about the quality of life of the individual and the clinical effectiveness and the exceptionality. And when I submitted it, the pharmacist said nobody at the hospital could have ever done that. And that's the problem you've got. There isn't the expertise for that specific disease. Probably only Professor Goodship could have done, well, probably a better job than me, but...
Anyone else? Yes?
This issue of expertise doesn't just apply to rare disease, though, because obviously within that committee, there may be specialisms, but not every condition that somebody might require an IPTR for, that there won't necessarily be that specialist knowledge within that area drug committee. And I think, this issue of having to prove exceptionality, it does apply to other long-term conditions as well. Sometimes it is difficult to prove why somebody might require that drug, i.e. they've tried all the treatment options, all the standard drugs that are available for that condition, and for whatever reason, none of them have been suitable. But that doesn't necessarily mean the person is an exceptional case. It simply means that the portfolio of drugs that the consultant has available, licensed by the SMC for that particular condition, isn't enough.
Can I raise a bigger issue? Because, we've been talking about rare conditions, and these are important. But there are also much more common conditions where a drug has been approved and licensed, but is not available. And, our patients come to us and say, look, I cannot manage with the existing therapy. And I'm talking about the specific instances of anticoagulants and the difficulty in managing anticoagulants. And for some patients, it's a real problem because of the interaction with foods and with other medicines. And they swing in and out of the therapeutic range, putting themselves at risk of hemorrhage and major complications. Now, we're facing a situation where there is substantial large-scale evidence, there's guideline approval, there's NICE approval, there's approval in Scotland, but no local approval. So, do we then face the issue of submitting an IPTR, which is not really what it was intended for, to use something that's approved but not available?
Yeah. Could Mr. Vox actually name a drug to which has occurred in this field? Is it Tigger-Keller, is that the one?
Well, I think that my colleague, Professor Newby, would maybe speak to ticagrelor, but I can speak to the issue of the novel anticoagulants.
Right.
And the reason I want to speak to that is that we have a really serious issue with the under-recognition of a major rhythm disturbance in Britain and in Scotland. That's atrial fibrillation, where only about half of the people are picked up. We've got about 125,000 people in Scotland with atrial fibrillation, much more common in the elderly, about 15% of those over 80. Why is it important? Because a quarter of those will have a stroke within 5 years. We've got existing treatments, which is warfarin anticoagulation, but existing treatments fail in about half because people can't manage with them, because they swing in and out of range, they have little bleeds. So now, for the first time, we have novel anticoagulants, which would fall into this category. So if somebody is failing on the existing treatments, we now have options with novel anticoagulants and good guidance and risk scores to know where the benefit-risk balance is favourable. And our patient comes to us and say, look, I cannot manage with that treatment. Why can I not get something that is approved for my care, my long-term care?
And that's a local decision, just to be quite clear on the record.
That is a local decision.
Because the 14 drug committees,
yes,
or the combinations of South, North, East and West, whatever combination, those committees make different decisions about drugs that are approved and in guidance.
Exactly. Exactly.
And how do clinicians feel about that? I mean,
absolutely frustrated.
Thank you.
Bob?
Just on that point, Mr. Fox, and please do correct me if I've got this procedure wrong. Once a drug's approved via the SMC, each health board will decide how best to place it on its formulary, would you call it?
That's right.
And it can sit there and it'll be standard treatment for some conditions but not for others. However, this committee took evidence before to say that individual clinicians can still prescribe, and it wouldn't be an IPTR you would do, but there was another, on the system, there was another tab and an option where you could prescribe that drug. So I just wanted to be clear for the committee that the decisions about whether to use a medicine as standard is different from individual clinicians being able or unable to prescribe a certain drug. My understanding was it was about the ease of going through that process, which could be wieldy and bureaucratic and time consuming. So I think the committee would appreciate whether or not it's actually a barrier or whether it's cumbersome.
No, it is a barrier because there is a lack of approval, and getting through the process is so cumbersome that it is a barrier to those patients getting treatment that is, proven in the evidence, accepted by the regulatory bodies, and accepted by the profession.
I'm just for clarity.
Can we tease out the local process, because we have concentrated in our evidence a lot of time on the SMC and its role and the IPTR, and while we were aware of the 14 drug committees that took place, it might be interesting to tease some of that out at the very local level. If you decided, as Bob suggested, that you wanted to prescribe that, well, what's stopping you, I think Bob's saying, what's stopping you from prescribing that for those patients that you believe, in your clinical opinion, would benefit greatly from that?
We cannot systematically use that for a group of patients. We have to go through the process individually.
Ah.
That's the issue.
So, in your case, what would be the scale of individual cases that you would? It's large numbers that you were talking.
It would be impossible. It would be impossible.
Right.
Chair, could we ask Professor Newby to come in on that, because I have raised the issue of Tiger Casello before. I should declare I used to be a consultant to AstraZeneca, who produced that drug, but I have raised it before because it was approved by SMC, and it then was approved by the East group in one way for one type of heart problem, and in the West for another type of heart problem. Subsequently, I understand the West has revised their approval so that they've now gone ahead of the East in terms of the range of conditions. But you have a situation that the public cannot understand, and I doubt clinicians can, that the same condition can be treated in one area and not in the other, and the difference is that the costs are something like 10 times as great for the new drug.
Yeah, well, we'll see if we can get an answer from you. A question and an answer there.
No, absolutely, and I share that frustration. So I think the disconnect is that ticagrelor is licensed for treatment of heart attacks. It's in the European guidelines, the American guidelines. It's been approved by NICE, it's been approved by SMC. But it's the cost, and that's brutally what it is. That's the issue, is the cost. And so in the East, we have selected a group of individual patients, and there's no rationale, personally, I don't think there's a huge rationale for why that particular group was taken, because it's effective across the whole range. And to be clear, this drug has a 1.4, 1.5% mortality benefit. So that means that you treat 70 people and you'll save one life. The cost is relatively high, but at £60 a month, and we're talking between 3 and 12 months treatment, that's not a huge amount of money on an individual basis compared to many of the other drugs we've been talking around. and not that dissimilar to what actually the previous drug, clopidogrel, cost when it was first initiated 15 years ago, when it was around £40 a month, and we used that. But we're in a different financial climate, and I think what has happened is that you get approval, you get guidance, but then at the local level they have to deliver all the services that they have, and they have to make harsh choices. And I think if ticagrelor was the same price as clopidogrel, it would be used universally across Scotland. And the issue is local people struggling with the constraints that they have on a budget. Personally, I think a mortality benefit is something well worth spending, because it's generally young people we're talking about, and the trials were done in people under 75. And we are investing other treatments which are much more expensive and often at the extremes of life, the elderly. Not that that is in any way not a good thing to do, but I do think that we need to think about where we invest and prioritise.
Yes.
I would entirely support what Dave Newby is saying about ticagrelor, and the cost of the novel anticoagulants is of the same order. And we're talking about not just the impact on saying, okay, here's a more convenient treatment that people don't have to monitor, but if you prevent stroke and you prevent multi-embolic stroke, you're preventing dementia and long-term institutional care among an elderly population. So what is our frustration is that here are treatments that can change that process, can change the proportion of individuals that will need long-term institutional care, and they're not being implemented.
Anyone else? Yes, certainly.
Please, yeah. I think the Alliance generally would call for greater public debate on about what taxpayers are and are not willing to fund, and further research and wider understanding of the social costs of not effectively managing long-term conditions. So, in other words, if somebody doesn't get effective medicines along with support to self-manage, there's going to be greater cost implications in terms of welfare benefits, because the person perhaps cannot work or might develop dementia and require social care support. And the public and decision makers need to consider that not all medicines are about life-saving or prolonging life. Many are about controlling symptoms and effectively managing conditions so that people have a certain quality of life and can remain economically active. Decisions about quality of life need to involve the voice of people with long-term conditions, as only they can give a true perspective of what matters to them, their levels of pain, fatigue, their mental health, and the burden upon their families of unpaid care.
Thanks. Is there anyone else? Not at this point. Bobby, you went back in before I call Mark?
No, I'd like to move on to another topic. I think Mark's obviously due, and he's not had the opportunity yet. So,
okay, I can come back. Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. I have a theme. Well, I've got a few questions around the theme, so we'll see how this goes. But I guess the first question is: how confident can we be that, be it the SMC or NICE or any other regulator, are seeing all the relevant trial data that relates to new medicines when they come to make an approval?
Anyone? Mr. Fox, yes, and yes.
Well, a number of us have served as external experts, either to NICE or SMC, and it is required when there's any new medicine that all of the available data are made available, so that all of the published data and preliminary data have to be made available for NICE or the SMC to make the decision. So I would have confidence that that isn't the stumbling block.
So we can always trust that if a trial shows unfavourable results, that it will either be concluded or at least reported on in all circumstances.
The issue about unpublished trials is a really important one, and I think that there may well be related agents or other agents where there are unpublished data. But if an organisation was submitting a dossier, they are bound by law to provide all the evidence relating to that particular agent.
So in terms of, and this is probably the last question, and welcome views from others as well, but so in terms of looking at the way information around new drugs is published or communicated, you're satisfied that the current system is effective. There wouldn't be a need to, for example, insist on systematic review in relation to all trials relating to new medicines when we come to looking at how that information about a new drug is published or communicated?
Well, the NICE process does go through systematic review. The difficulty is they may not capture if there are related drugs that have never reached the market and have never been published. That could be an issue.
Professor Newby, you want to?
Nothing more than just to reinforce what Keith has said. I think most people acknowledge that the NICE and the SMC process is very robust. And they do have access to information that is not necessarily in the public domain. I also have seen that, and it is a requirement. And I think the class effect that you were just discussing there, where it's not the drug that you're considering but a related drug, that's a very small point, I think. I think overall most people are very impressed by it, and in fact I know a lot of countries are now starting to adopt very similar processes because of how they need to prioritise medicines and use very similar methodology. And I know North America has looked a long time at the NICE approach because they see that as a fair way of really critically appraising things.
Anyone else wish to respond to Mark's questions, comments? No? Yes, Professor Weechip.
Colleagues' comments, but in addition, another process has gone through of the European Medicines Agency, which also require rigorous review of trial documents. So even before some medicines get to NICE, they've already been undergone one rigorous review already.
Thank you. No other members at this point? Bob, you wish to pursue another line? Oh, sorry, Lynette, sorry. I'm getting concentrating down in this corner here. It's very busy, so I need to...
It's a different line. I mean, we know that there's a pretty robust, as we've said, system in place for assessing new drugs. It has been pointed out, I think the British Heart Foundation did mention it, and it's been raised with the committee before, that there isn't the same sort of robust assessment of non-pharmacological interventions, and perhaps do you see real pressure being put on on these sort of interventions, which can be equally beneficial to quality of life and length of life?
Well, you know, the NICE organisation and SMC do tackle devices, for example. But you're right. In the past, it was pharmacological agents that had the greatest scrutiny, and maybe a device or new valve or something that was a technology bit of kit didn't go through quite the same process. But now it's changed. And so, for example, if there is a new kind of stent, NICE treats it the same way as it would a new drug.
I was thinking in terms, I mean, there are other things like cardiac rehabilitation and
Yes.
specialist nursing and things like that. I mean, I think there are probably a lot of these sort of interventions within the NHS which are not being scrutinised particularly robustly. Have you any comments on that?
Yes, you raise a very big issue where there are traditional treatments that have been in place for a long time, therefore they've not been reviewed recently in the context of current care. And I think that's a process that has to be tackled, but it's a long-term process.
Because presumably that could then lead to withdrawal
Yes,
of certain things and
I agree.
free up
Agree.
resource for other new
Yes.
treatments. Thank you.
Any other comments? So this is a recurring theme, I think, about how we assess value and outcomes of current procedures and medicines that are in place, while the challenge is the introduction of new and innovative medicines and procedures, and as a recurring theme. Is any other comment on that? No? Bob Doris.
Thank you. I've got lots of various questions I'd like to explore. I'll just stay on IPTRs for the moment. When an IPTR is successful, is any work done to see what the impact is on the individual patient that received the particular medicine? Because if an IPTR is successful and it's demonstrated possible to evidence that it's had a dramatic effect on the patient, does that then feed back into the process to say to the SMC, well, you might want to look at this again? Or conversely, unfortunately, if the IPTR is successful and the benefits are at the margins, does that feed back into the system for future decision making either? So are we led by the results of the actual patients who receive the medication from IPTR process?
Anyone want to pick that up?
I think it depends a little bit on the treatment that's been used, and certainly I think when you're using them a lot and you're seeing that it is a benefit, of course that just adds fuel to the fire to try and get it more mainstream and accepted. I think in terms of the mechanism of audit of outcome is a very important one, and is one that I think a lot of health boards just generally are investing more and more in to try and tackle how best to use their resources and to make sure they're aligned. But in a systematic way, I'm not sure that it is. Maybe that's something that could be thought about. But again, it comes down to time and the challenge. Certainly, I agree the IPTRs are cumbersome to you, having filled one out and spent a long time, well into the night, to do that. It is cumbersome to do it for your patients. But I also can't see a way around it, because if you are going to have it assessed, you have to provide all the information so the panel can make a valued judgment and a good judgment. And they need all that information. What you're alluding to is giving feedback, and that is, I always think, is very, very important, is to actually feedback what the result of your intervention has been. Of course, in the clinic, we do that all the time. We treat patients and we see whether they get better or not.
Anyone else on that?
Well, there's just a word of caution, and that is that, you know, many of our treatments are tested in large numbers of patients, and idiosyncratic responses from a few could actually swing the interpretation, whereas it's the overall effect, the net benefit and hazard, that's most robust from a large experience. So while feedback and audit, yes, useful, we could be misled by idiosyncratic responses.
By misled, do you mean the results wouldn't be as positive as you thought they would have been ahead of the IPTR being granted? Is that what you would describe as idiosyncratic?
Well, they could, for example, be somebody who produced a dramatically positive response or somebody dramatically negative response. Okay. And, you know, that wouldn't give the whole picture as how that population behaves.
I find this a really interesting line of questioning, Convener, because the vision you sometimes get is that if the IPTR is not granted, then some dramatic ill outcome will befall upon the person who doesn't get the IPTR. But when you look at the other end of the outcome, where there may have been a dramatic benefit, but there may have been no benefit at all, no one's going, well, there was no benefit. Are we analysing why there was no benefit? We need to make sure we're getting these decisions right, and there has to be some kind of audit of that.
But you know, I think we've got to consider what sort of treatment effect we might expect. Let's say we have a treatment that reduces the risk of stroke by 30%. Now, for that individual patient, that's really important. But they could have gone through a period of not having a stroke anyway, and to show it in one patient is really difficult. And that's why the much bigger experience is scientifically the most robust.
I accept that. I just find it frustrating when we want to be led by the evidence as a committee, and then that's an obvious thing for us to ask. Convener, I do have other lines of questioning, but there's other members here who may wish to...
I think there's others wanting to respond to your line of question. I think Professor Goodchips wanted to respond as well. And anyone else, feel free to come in at any point. Just catch my eye.
I think you raise a really important point. The difficulty from a rare disease point of view is there might be only one patient in your country, and so if that patient, you know, perhaps didn't do well, that might bias what happened in the future. For rare diseases, it is mandatory that a registry is kept for all patients who are treated in a rare disease with a novel agent. And I think perhaps what would be better is the overall results for that fed back to individual boards, so they can get a big picture of, you know, what's happened. They can see what's happened to their one patient, but they can also see what's happened to the other 99 treated elsewhere.
Anyone else on that line? No? Richard?
Yes, on that line, just to take it a little further, you know, that's dealt with the rare diseases where you've got to register, but what about things that are somewhat less rare? Do you think that at the moment we have adequate follow-up on the new drugs that are coming out? Because it seems to me that we get through this fairly complex business of licensing and then SMC and NICE and then local approval, but then when you use it as clinicians, you know, we need to be certain that the experience you get either defines the drug, as in the case of the anticoagulants, to a group, that you say it works well with this group or it is necessary in this group. Or in the case of an anti-cancer drug, it may be that the group, and I think a recent bowel cancer had one with where the 70% of them had a particular genetic marker, and it worked in that group, but not the 30%, not as well in the 30% that it didn't. Now, are we actually collating and collecting that information, both in Scotland and across the UK, and indeed across Europe when it is a bit rarer, in a way that allows us to make a better determination of how we should be using these drugs?
Well, the European Medicines Agency, can provide a requirement when they are looking at the approval of a new agent and put it into a category if the confidence bounds for the effect and the hazard are such that they still have a worry about it. They can require so-called phase 4 studies, which in fact are large registries. So if there is uncertainty, they may well be required by the licensing authority. And there are a number of other treatments, like, for example, there is a very novel treatment for high blood pressure that's resistant high blood pressure, that doesn't respond to drugs, and it involves ablating the nerves to the renal arteries. And it's really important to know the long-term impact of that. And so what's happened in the UK is the profession has set up a registry for every single case. But to do that for all of the drugs would be impossible. And I think we've got to be guided by where the European Medicines Agency says there's uncertainty, a grey area, so let's require some post-marketing surveillance.
Yes, Professor Newman.
I think also in Scotland we do have some fantastic electronic record systems, and certainly a lot of the Chief Scientist, Andrew Morris, is doing is addressing a lot of that issue as well. And there have been quite a few examples across Scotland where people have done non-intrusive patient records research to address that very issue of post-marketing surveillance, and indeed industry has collaborated on some of those because they're very keen to use it. So I think in Scotland actually we're very lucky to have that potential resource.
Anyone else on that? Mark MacDonald?
Convener, sorry, it just following on from the responses that came to my questions, there'd been something niggling with me that I think I'll kick myself if I don't get it put on the record, and it was Mr. Fox said in response to one of my questions that there may be an issue where a drug has been trialled or there have been trials done and the drug has never been submitted for approval, therefore there is no obligation for that trial data to necessarily be published. And that might be an issue when it comes to looking at other drugs or related drugs, both for trial and then for approval. I wonder, and we possibly don't have the powers here in Scotland, but I wonder if, in Mr. Fox's view, it would be beneficial that all trial data, whether or not the drug ever makes it to the market, should be published as a matter of course in order to inform both future trials and future approval decisions in relation to new medicines.
I personally would be very much in favour of all of that information being in the public domain. And maybe the solution, I think, is to have an electronic record for the results of those studies. Because it may well be that a study is submitted, and because it's not very interesting, the journal turns it down. But there has to be a way of there being a depository where any independent person can look at the data and say, I agree with that interpretation or I disagree with that interpretation, but it's in the public domain. And I think that that would be an advance.
I appreciate that. I don't know if anybody else has a comment in relation to that.
Oh, no takers.
Okay.
Yes,
sorry,
Professor
just quickly, just comment that there are increasingly now open access journals which tend to get around this, but you still have to pay to publish it now because You get it for free, or generally free, if it's of interest and the journal wants to sell the journal. But when open access, it's making sure that the methodology is robust and that there's been some peer review, because the danger is that you get a lot of rubbish, to put it bluntly, published, unless it has some oversight and has some review of the data by independent experts in the field. And so there's an element of necessity for that. And I think with increasing availability of open access journals, I think more data will come out. I think it would be good, potentially, to put some onus on industry to perhaps publish more of their data, which might be uninteresting in an open format, without compromising, obviously, their commercial opportunity or IP or what have you. But I think that would certainly be something that could be encouraged, and perhaps in association with ABPI could be taken forward.
And just following on from that then, is there an issue around the ownership of data in relation to trials, in terms of whether or not that would be possible to have data published?
Not quite sure what you mean.
in terms of who owns the data for the trial, whether it's the academic conducting the study or the company that is funding the study.
Well, there's a lot of research that's done purely by the company, and obviously the company would own that. When it's done in collaboration with the academic, it depends on the setting of the study and the relationship that has. Sometimes it's completely led by the academic, sometimes jointly. There are various different models.
But in the establishment of any large study, one of the requirements is that this will be submitted for publication irrespective of the result.
And one final point, just to reassure you a little bit, is that now all trials have to be registered. So they might not be published, but you know that the trial has happened, and so you can go knocking on the door. Yes, Ian.
Professor Goodchip and then Len Woodward.
I just wanted to add,
Oh.
I think that's some information that should be available to patients and patients' organisations in a language that they can understand.
Thank you. Anyone else? There. Professor Goodchip.
It's obvious all trials have to undergo a rigorous governance procedure before they're allowed to commence, and there's no reason why part of that governance procedure should not be a guarantee that any results will be published as a part of that. So that industry might have to be, that would be part of the process of getting approval.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yes. Could I just add as well that there was an issue that was highlighted by some of our members that previously, I think that because the ABPI have tightened up their code of conduct a little bit, some organisations do find it difficult to access information, a briefing or a patient leaflet about the drug with information from the trial that's available in plain language that they can use to base their submission upon. And I think there really needs to be a little bit of work around that. Obviously, there should be a balance between pharma companies being able to solicit patient organisations and encouraging them to put submissions in, perhaps spoon feeding them the information, but they do need something to base their submission on, and I think that's not always readily available for every new drug in Scotland.
Okay. You want back in, Richard?
Just very briefly, just to ask the patient organisations whether they feel there's adequate patient representation on the IPTR groups.
Yes.
I have no direct experience of IPTRs and the IPTR groups, but as far as patient representation is concerned, I can tell you the way the system worked extremely well in England. We formed part of a submission that was put to AGNES, the Advisory Group for National Specialised Services, and we were allowed by the NHS to put forward a patient experience. This comprised evidence from 10 of our members who had direct experience of the disease. In addition, NHS supplied us with consultants to help us, first of all, elicit the information and present it to AGNES. And we produced, in the end, a 16,000-word document, which was an extremely powerful piece of work. It went forward to Agnes. Agnes took the clinical submission as well and recommended to the Department of Health that eculizumab, the drug that we've been speaking about, was centrally funded in England for the treatment of AHUS. That advice from Agnes was overruled by the Department of Health just last week when they put the case to NICE for further consideration of its affordability. It doesn't detract, I don't think, from the consideration that the patient group was given and the assistance that the patient group was given in providing this patient voice or patient experience for the whole process.
Yes, Mr. Byrne.
When IPTR is put forward to the local committee, the patient who the IPTR relates to has an opportunity to have a say at the decision-making committee meeting. They can choose whether to appear or not appear at that committee.
Can they take an expert with them? Can they take a patient advocate with them?
Yes.
They can.
Yes.
That's very helpful.
What's the level of participation in that process? There's no level. They're there as witnesses, not participants, are they not?
They're there to support their submission for the drug on the IPTR for them specifically, and to give the patient's own personal impact in their view on it.
Does that happen? I'm just thinking back to a constituent case of my own, and that experience was very difficult for that patient. As I recall, what I'm asking is, does this vary from one board to another? Because I think in my case, the patient was not allowed to participate or speak, and there was a dispute about whether her nominated expert was allowed to make representation. It was just the basic presentation, and So I'm just asking whether it's variable across the country. There's a greater participation in Tayside, obviously. Is that the same in Glasgow Clyde or Edinburgh? Can anyone speak to that?
Say that in Lothian, the patient representative, I don't recall the patient being allowed to be present. Certainly wasn't in my case.
I say by advocate, an advocate is not a professional person, it's someone that's able to speak for the person rather than a professional speaking on their behalf.
Yeah. Well, yes, Mr. Woodward.
I don't know too much about the Scottish IPTR process, but the one I've been involved in England, we weren't allowed to do that. We could only give written statement, and I would like to have given the opportunity, because for the Agnes experience, we did do that. A patient told them what it was like. And I know in Wales, they don't allow the patient to talk to the decision-making forum. They have somebody, a lay person, to talk for them.
We can find an answer we can write to the health boards and ask them how the patients participate or level of participation. I just thought I would ask a question. Is there any other questions at this point? Bob? Bob Doris and then Nanette.
Yeah, just the convener, we heard talk about the social care cost there could be if a drug is not provided to patients, and I'm minded that the UK government under Reserve Matters is looking at value-based pricing and trying to look at the holistic cost of medicines as they come through the system. I think this committee's been trying to find out a little bit about that, but it does seem quite cloaked in mystery about how that's all going to shake down. Do you think in a few years' time one of the things eventually, once it all shakes down, we'll be looking at will be IPTR or approvals more generally, is looking at in more detail, whether it's the pharma companies, whether it's the IPTR process, about what the on-costs would be to society as well as the individual for not prescribing certain medicines, and in the future should we hope that would have an impact in both the SMC approval process and the IPTR process?
I think you've put your finger on something that's absolutely fundamental, because if you take the example of the anticoagulants, the assessment that NICE did was to say, okay, what is the cost of the new drug? What is the cost of warfarin anticoagulation? What's the cost of running the clinics? We add that up, that's it. And it came in the boundary that NICE would approve. What they did not consider is how many strokes were prevented and what the impact was on long-term care of those strokes. So absolutely, we need to look at the long-term implications of either prescribing or not prescribing a medication.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else wish to respond to that?
Yes, I would agree that there needs to be more consideration of the societal benefits of medicines, and the Alliance accepts that the quality adjusted life year system is robust, but it isn't clear to the Alliance, or from reading the transcript of the last session to many others, exactly how the plans for value-based pricing will be interpreted in Scotland and how that's going to interact with the current SMC process. So I think that there needs to be more research in Scotland and widely, obviously, if this is a Department of Health plan for value-based pricing, about burden of illness and systems which take into account the long-term effect on society of prescribing. And in our written submission, we referenced the STAR approach, which is the socio-technical allocation of resources approach developed by NHS Sheffield in partnership with Health Foundation and London School of Economics. And that's a value for money analysis with stakeholder engagement, which uses a deliberative process involving stakeholders, including patients and the public. So perhaps we need to look at some systems like that.
I just wanted that to be put on the record, because I think it was the Alliance that had mentioned it during earlier conversations.
Okay. Nanette.
I understand that there's a right of appeal against an IPTR decision. Is there a feel amongst people here as to how that is operating effectively across Scotland, or how does it work?
Mr. Goodall?
From not having been through the IPTRs myself personally, I can only take on reference information. There is a process that they can go through. How effective it is, I can't answer that. It's maybe something that the committee wishes to seek to the board.
It's a general area there about, about patient knowledge and indeed clinical experience about this. Anyway, we can pick that up, I'm sure. Is there any further questions on it? No? I mean, I take it, going back to Richard's issue, that there has been certainly some movement on this whole area in the course of this inquiry. We've got a review underway in terms of the general access to new medicines. We've got a review into the individual patient treatment request. And we've had, a fund announced for rare diseases. So there has been some movement. I presume everyone is supportive of that movement and, and these issues being addressed. There's no dissent there. I suppose the next question is, what are the major the priority issue that should come out of that for the various interests here in the table? If anyone would wish to comment for the record before I close this session. And I suppose it's also an opportunity to cover any areas that you feel the committee haven't raised in their questions and issues that you would want to leave with us for consideration when we conclude this inquiry and proceed to producing a report. So you have that opportunity at this point if you wish to take it. But and if there's anything else after the committee that we'd encourage you to keep an eye in the next session, and indeed have confidence that you can, in a more informal way, cover issues that weren't picked up at this session by emailing the clerks and to inform the committee. Is there anyone at this stage who would like to add anything or pick up on anything at this point? Yes?
I would like to add to the point that Nancy made about societal costs. and that, in fact, the NHS Scotland are leading on developing financial models for that already. We have a sister disease called HUS, and NHS Scotland have used quite robust data for determining medical interventions and health programmes based on their data.
Okay. Anyone else? Mr. McNair.
I think we would like to see greater consistency in the treatment of rare diseases and the funding of the treatment of rare diseases between England and Scotland. There are various anomalies between the two, and I'm sure your committee, after its deliberation and the various investigations that have gone on, will come to a system that will be effective and acceptable in Scotland. We would like to see the same system over both Scotland and England and Wales and Northern Ireland.
Mr. Fox?
I want to highlight the fact that, as Dave Newby pointed out, in Scotland we have probably one of the most robust record linkage systems that provides linkage of long-term outcomes with individual patients. The block is the issue about confidentiality and anonymous records. And if we can get pressure to say that for the purposes of improving patient safety, a truly anonymized record that doesn't compromise the patient can be accessed by bodies that need to collate the data, that would be a big advance.
That's useful. Mr. Gunn.
Can I acknowledge the work of the SNC and their introduction of a public involvement officer, because that's enabled patients to become more involved in the decision of new medications coming on board. One thing I would make, and it's a constructive criticism, Angus Long-Term Conditions groups have a membership of 100 people with different conditions. Because we are not a constituted organisation, we have no committee, we have no papers of statute or a company base, we are not allowed to have any input to the SNC. Therefore, that 100 people that we represent won't have a voice on any SNC. Also, the SNC will not take an individual's information either, so they can go unrepresented.
Okay. Is there anything else that... Yes?
George's point that the Alliance does work very closely with the Scottish Medicines Consortium, and we acknowledge the positive impact that the public involvement project has had over the last 2 years in increasing the number of submissions. And it does demonstrate a really positive commitment to public engagement, but I think that there is still an opportunity to enhance the system and enhance the transparency of the process about how SMC decisions are arrived at. There were a number of issues that were raised by our members around the process, and there is some element of third sector organisations either not being able to, because they're not a constituted group, make a submission, or being unsure as to the level of importance that their submission has in the decision-making process. So, for example, if you look at the briefing notes on the SMC website for a drug that has been passed, it simply states whether there has or there hasn't been a patient interest group submission. It doesn't go into level of detail about what was in that submission. And I think that by enhancing the transparency of how these decisions are arrived at, that can only be a positive thing that will encourage more submissions.
No one else at this point? Yes.
I'd just like to thank the committee for allowing us to have our say today. We're a small charity run entirely by volunteers, representing a tiny group of people with a serious but obscure disease. And we rarely get the opportunity to voice our concerns, and I'd just like to thank the committee for the opportunity today.
Thank you.
I'd also like to echo that as well.
Right, thank you for that. You know, at this point then, I'll close this session and express our appreciation as a committee for the time and evidence you've given us this morning. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. Suspend at this point. Thank you. We now continue agenda item number 1, access to new medicines, and we move and welcome our new panel. And as we did the last time, it would be useful just to introduce myself, and we'll walk round the room. My name is Duncan McNeill. I'm the MSP for Greenock and Inverclyde and convener of the Health and Sport Committee.
Thank you. I'm Alistair Kent. I'm the Director of Genetic Alliance UK, which is an alliance of 156 different patient organisations supporting families across the spectrum of genetic disorders. I'm also the Chair of Rare Disease UK, which is a multi-stakeholder coalition which has been created for the express purpose of supporting the improvement of services and support for families with rare diseases.
Bob Doris, MSP for Glasgow and Deputy Convener of the Committee.
Hello, I'm Peter Hillman. I'm a haematologist from Leeds with an interest in paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, or PNH for short. I lead the national service in England and chair the 2 international committees on PNH, and also support the Scottish Clinic on PNH, which is led by one of the Scottish haematologists in Monklands.
Richard Simpson, I'm MSP for Mid Scotland and Fife.
I'm Leslie Lolliger. I'm the founder and chairman of the charity PNH Scotland. It's a charity set up to support PNH patients throughout Scotland. I also am a patient with PNH.
Gil Patterson, MSP for Clydebank and Mulgai.
Mark Roberts, I'm a consultant neurologist in Salford in Manchester. I lead the neuromuscular services in Manchester, have a special interest in metabolic disorders, and have seen all the Scottish patients with the rare condition we're talking about today, Pompe disease.
I'm Mark MacDonald. I'm an MSP for North East Scotland.
I'm John Fletcher and I represent the AGSD, which is the Association of Glucose Storage Diseases, and my role is to support families who suffer from Pompe disease.
Annette Milne, an MSP for North East Scotland.
I'm Marion Ferguson from the Ivacaftor Patient Interest Group, and I'm chair of that, and that is a group for patients with the rare form of cystic fibrosis, the G551D mutation.
David Torrance, MSP, Kirkcaldy constituency.
Richard Lyle, MSP, Central Region.
Thank you for that. Those formalities are now over, so hopefully we can have a good exchange, a good session. And I move to Mark MacDonald to ask the first question in this session.
Thank you, Convener. During the last session, I asked a number of questions around trial data relating to new medicines and whether we can be confident, firstly, that the regulatory bodies are seeing all of the available trial data that relates to new medicines. But following on from that, we actually got a discussion around unpublished trial data which relates to related medicines. And I just wondered if there was a view around the table about how we ensure that the best available data is made available to regulatory bodies to ensure that we're getting the most robust decisions around new medicines that are coming onto the market, because both in terms of those which are approved and ensuring that they're being approved on the back of the most robust data available, and also in terms of those that are not being approved, whether we're confident that all the trial data is there to allow the regulators to make the best decisions. So throw that one out there.
Yes, Professor Hillman.
I should have mentioned that I also sit on the MHRA Advisory Board for Haematology and Oncology, so see the submissions of new therapies coming through across oncology, so see it from the other side of the fence, if you like. In terms of the data for new therapies that are just being approved, there's limited amount of trial data because they're all virtually all sponsored by the pharmaceutical industry itself, and is used for submission and has to be used for submission for approval of the drug. So virtually all the trial data at that stage will be in that domain. Part of, as was alluded to in the earlier meeting, part of the ethical approval of trials is a section that this data should be published and presented at international meetings and in peer-reviewed literature. So there is an obligation by the companies to have that data peer-reviewed. It doesn't always happen, I have to say, further down the line, but it should be presented. And then the other point I think to make is that, for example, with the drug that we're involved with, or I've been involved with now for over 10 years for PNH, data evolves after the trial and the approval, and we publish our own data, for example, in terms of survival. So at the time of approval, you may not have the survival data, but now, in PNH, we have very convincing survival data. So even after the approval, data continues to accumulate. So the data should be available.
Does anyone else wish to respond to Mark's question? Oh, sorry. Yes, please.
It was actually just to quote a Professor Elborn from Belfast. He's a Professor of Respiratory Medicine at Queen's University in Belfast, and he actually talked about the data. He said, these data showing the consistent and sustained benefit of this medicine confirms that ivacaftor has the potential to make significant difference to the lives of these children and young people with cystic fibrosis G551D. But the data don't capture the full benefit for the patients. It's very noticeable in the patients that I look after that they're able to do things that they previously couldn't do before starting treatment with ivacaftor. They feel better and more able to plan the future. And I think, you know, data is very, very important, but I think we do need to have much more case studies being brought forward to the SMC, either through patient interest groups, where people can actually see the difference to the quality of life that these medicines are making, rather than just looking at the data alone.
Mr. Kent, and of course I'll bring you back in, Professor Hillman, and indeed Dr. Roberts, so you wish indicated to come in.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Convener. I think it's important to recognise when we're looking at clinical trials for rare diseases that often these are carried out on very small populations, and although the data may be of high quality, it's not always in great depth. And very often marketing authorisations are granted by the Medicines Agency, the European Medicines Agency, on a conditional basis so that further evidence is required. And I think the evidence that is submitted to the Medicines Agency for the granting of the marketing authorisation is available, but it's much more difficult to get that real-world data from the application of the drug in practice. And I think also, again, in the previous session, one of the witnesses referred to open access journals and publication of information in journals that are freely available. In that situation, it is the cost of publication is met by the institution that generates the data rather than the sale of the journal in which the data is published. And whilst that may open up the readership, if resources are constrained, there is a danger that publishing institution, that the submitting institutions, the universities, the hospitals, the companies may choose not to incur the expense to publish data that is of limited quality, shall we say, if that will impose an additional cost on strained resources. So, in principle, I think the idea of open access and publication of all information is a very good and a very positive development. But I think we need to be careful that the resources are factored in to make that a realistic possibility and not put institutions that are already under financial pressure in a cleft stick, as it were, in deciding what they can afford to publish and what they can't afford to publish.
Can I take Dr. Roberts and then come back to Professor Hillman in response to Mark?
And very much to echo what Mr. Kent was saying, there is obviously a risk of publication bias for positive data in clinical trials. To give you a flavour of how small these clinical trials are, the biggest trial ever in the world in Pompe disease had just 90 patients. So these are very small trials, but it's a very rare disease. On a positive publication issue, because the condition is so rare, observational data that might not otherwise pass a threshold for inclusion in a trial is quite frequently published. And for example, there's been a large study of Italian patients, a countrywide study, a Spanish paper and a German paper, and shortly an English paper about to be published on all of the patients with Pompe disease. The German paper was especially interesting because it showed many patients deteriorating on the treatment that is now available, but in the patients who showed the biggest benefit, there seemed to be an additional benefit from exercise. So that study has actually been very powerful to reaffirm benefit in some and enhance our understanding and others about potential additional therapies. But I'd agree entirely, the patients who do very badly probably don't get published, unfortunately.
Professor Hillman.
Just going to follow up on Marion's point earlier. These therapies for the rare diseases tend to be very targeted treatments that are specific for that disease, and so the early results from the trials are very dramatic in terms of stopping the process of the disease. But of course, in terms of things like in PNH, renal failure, thrombosis, death, that data comes later, and we had the data for PNH with eculizumab in 2007 when the drug was licensed. In England, it was funded from 2008, but it's only really in 2010 that we started to demonstrate survival advantages and thrombosis and renal failure advantage. So I think that comes, our experience is that if you have a therapy that very effectively treats the disease, the evidence we gain, particularly from national services we have in the UK, including the Scottish patients, is very powerful several years later.
Mark's just going to come back with that in the net, not obviously.
I think that's been very helpful, and obviously I recognise the rare conditions by their definition do not lend themselves to large trials, but at the same time I think some of the information has been beneficial. I guess the question I was going to pose as a follow-up, and I take on board Mr. Kent's point around the resource constraints, but Professor Hillman said that there is an ethical obligation to publish, but that doesn't always happen. Is it your view that we perhaps need to have a legal requirement to publish as opposed to an ethical obligation?
I think certainly sorry.
Yes,
I think in terms of the primary trial data that's used for the approval of drugs, that is almost always published because that's the key trials. I think the follow-up data and in terms of the ethical issues for where the trial's approved, the primary endpoint of the trial is what maybe progression-free survival or some other endpoint is published. But the real data, the important data, comes out later, and that isn't part of. It's very hard to oblige that to be approved because the trials may not be followed up long term. I also have concerns over the open access journals because the academic groups are under an intense amount of pressure to publish data, but in journals that are peer-reviewed and have high impact factors, because that's where our funding comes from. And the open access journals are just as difficult to create manuscripts for, create a lot of work and have very little value to the academic institution. And so it's actually a very good concept, but I don't think in reality it works.
Do you have a supplementary on this theme of questions?
On that point, I take it from what's just been said that there are no sanctions that can be applied where publication requirements are not met.
I can...
Sorry, I just wanted to also, if you think about the real-world situation of clinicians working, with patients with a condition under pressure of time and resources, it is difficult to add additional requirements on them to record and to publish data. I think, if there is to be an ethical obligation or a legal obligation to publish this kind of data, then you must make sure that the clinicians are supported with the infrastructure to allow that data to be collected systematically and realistically examined in order to reach conclusions. Otherwise, I think there's a danger of a mass of unstructured information coming out, which will be difficult to interpret and difficult to make use of in terms of policy and planning decisions.
Professor Hillman, you.
To just the next question, I think there is an obligation. I don't think there's a process to ensure that obligation is carried through. I don't have any experience of publications in rare diseases not being presented publicly, although recently with a more common disease, which I'm also interested in, one of the trials, which was a negative trial, wasn't published, and I was the chief investigator for the UK, and I've insisted on getting the report, and they've actually last week said to the company we should publish the data because it's very valuable data for the patient group, but I don't know about the legality of that obligation.
Okay, thank you.
Just to follow on from those points. I think absolutely at the moment it is practically very difficult to collect the sort of robust scientific data that one would do in a trial in real-world clinical practice. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if NICE taking on some of the roles that currently Agnes hold in England, if that became an obligation. And given that Agnes has been so transparent in making its report system available, that data could eventually become available. And given the sums involved to treat these rare patients, I, for one, feel that would be a reasonable request, but I'd very much echo Alistair Kent's comment. We must be given the time resources and the administrative support to do it if it becomes a legal requirement.
I just wonder, Convener, if, I'm not familiar with the acronym AGNES. So I just wonder if we could maybe get that clarified just for the record.
So you'll be aware, of course, and very much like the SMC, NICE deal with many disorders and look at the cost effectiveness of these treatments. But there was a decision taken to have a specialist group to look at very rare conditions whose treatment might be very expensive and where centrally commissioned services might be required. And that's been a very successful process over the last 5 years. However, that's now coming back under NICE. But Michael Rawlins has already stated that he's keen that the attributions of Agnes are continued by the NICE process.
And would that process therefore be similar to the fund that was recently announced by the Cabinet Secretary around the £21 million Rare Medicines Fund?
Yes?
Yeah. Not entirely, no. Agnes, the acronym stands for the Advisory Group for National Specialist Services, which was set up to advise the National Specialist Commissioning Team, or NSCT, in England. Agnes was mandated to make recommendations to the Secretary of State for conditions affecting fewer than 500 patients in England. And if Agnes made a positive recommendation to the Secretary of State, then the Secretary of State had the power previously to instruct the health service to provide the service or not, as the case may be. When the Health and Social Care Act came into force, the Secretary of State had removed from himself the power to make demands upon the NHS, and the National Health Service Commissioning Board was given the responsibility for making those day-to-day allocations. So Agnes no longer had a route to implement its recommendations under the law. So Agnes is being dissolved with effect from the 31st of March and being replaced by, or the responsibility for making those decisions, formerly the province of Agnes, has been passed to NICE. Now, NICE has not yet determined the procedure it will adopt for those very rare conditions. Historically, they looked at whether their existing procedures would work in terms of very rare conditions and decided that although there was no theoretical barrier to the NICE process delivering a result, the evidence, the population of the equation to determine cost and clinical effectiveness would be so thin on the ground as to invalidate the process through which things went. So it's not, Agnes doesn't have a separate, or hadn't got a separate fund to disperse. They had the power to recommend to the Secretary of State, and then the Secretary of State had to determine where the resources that were necessary if his decision was to implement were coming from. So it's a slightly different situation.
Leslie Lolliger wants to come in on that point, don't you?
You mentioned the £21 million fund, you know, this extra fund that was brought forward. The issue that we have with the £21 million fund is that for PNH patients, for example, it won't make any difference at all, because it's stated that the fund can only be accessed if you have a successful individual patient treatment request, or IPTR. And obviously with the current IPTR system as it stands, PNH patients and other rare disease patients are not getting through that system.
Any further responses to Mark's question? No. Richard?
Yes, I think that takes us neatly on to the central problem with rare diseases, which is, of course, that the the group and the research that is done to produce the license is very small. And the requirement of IPTR is that it mustn't have the individual must be different from the general population covered by the medicine's license. So it seems to me that that is absolutely, for this group that we've got as witnesses in this session, a total catch-22 that cannot be resolved by the current IPTR system. Now, am I misreading this? Because, you know, it means that on P&H case, for example, you're unlikely to be exceptional to the licensed group, even with the experience you've had. And that might be, you know, not true of other conditions where the experience would say, yes, within our group, even though it's rare, we have a subgroup where beneficial. But I wonder if the witnesses could comment on this, what seems to me an absolutely fundamental flaw with IPTR. Am I correct in saying that?
Professor Hillman and Dr. Roberts.
I mean, absolutely. We had approval for eculizumab on 195 patients, of which 35 were in the UK, and every patient benefited in those trials. And subsequently, since we've had a nationally funded service, and in fact most of the Scottish patients have eventually got through the IPTR system in most of Scotland, they've all benefited from treatment. And so it's impossible, because of the way the trials are designed, where you take the patients with a specific abnormality and treat them with a specific drug which interferes with that abnormality, that you'd expect the patients all to benefit. And so then to then select patients separately is impossible. And the other issue with the IPTR system that we've had is in the cases where a patient has been declared not to be exceptional from the group and therefore not funded, although in the rest of the United Kingdom and Wales and Northern Ireland will fund their patients, they would have been funded. If a complication then occurs, like a thrombotic complication, the patient can die within 24 hours or 48 hours. So there isn't the time to go back to the IPTR before you can rescue the patient with treatment. And we've treated people around the UK the day the complications happened, because we don't need to go through a bureaucratic process to get approval. So not only does the IPTR system disadvantage rare diseases generally, but it also means that if a patient's really in extremis, there's no mechanism to get funding.
Dr. Roberts.
Well, very much to echo the points that have been made, with a very rare and indeed, as NICE would define it, ultra-orphan condition with a prevalence of less than 5 in 100,000, and in the case of Pompe, only 111 patients in the UK, it's really, really difficult to try and show exceptionality and show that one patient is radically different to another. And clearly, as we've referenced already, the clinical trials have been small and have sought to recruit the vast majority of patients. So to try and show that one individual patient is different to those trial patients is extremely, if not completely, impossible. So I think the current IPTR system is a difficult one to put into practice. And I think there are several potential problems, therefore. I think clinicians might be put off the process because they might feel they might not succeed on behalf of their patient, which might, of course, both be tremendously upsetting to the patient and damage the doctor-patient relationship. And secondly, I think the patients themselves might feel that it's a very rigorous process to go through and that they might find it difficult. And thirdly, and with many of the conditions we're hearing about, these are very progressive conditions, and in the time course that the process takes, the patient may be so much worse. So whilst I think the SMC has a worldwide, very enviable reputation for its ability to judge evidence, it's a difficult area when you come to rare diseases. And I think a different approach may be required, as this committee recognises.
Mr. Kent.
Thank you. I think it's also, I think you're absolutely right. There is this catch-22 situation in respect of IPTRs. And, you know, the thinking, the underpinning the notion of an IPTR is that there is a kind of, you know, an on-off switch that can demonstrate difference, you know, so that, I mean, in the case of ivacaftor, you can say, yes, there is a specific genetic mutation that those people who have it respond to the drug and those people who don't have it don't respond to the drug. But that's a very rare situation in reality. You know, most rare diseases, like most other diseases, you have a continuum of response. And given the amount of evidence that you have about effectiveness at the point at which the drug becomes available, it's not possible to say that patient A will respond better than patient B. So you can't make a case for exceptionality because all the patients in the group, and we're talking small numbers, but all the patients in the group will respond to a greater or lesser extent. Now, over time, you may be able to gather that evidence and determine that some patients respond better than others or whatever, and do a kind of parsing of the patient community to focus on those who do better. Although in the absence of an alternative, most patients would rather be in a position where they have the opportunity to benefit. You know, 10% of not a lot is better than 100% of nothing, if nothing means that you progress and die. But if you don't allow patients to have access to the medication in the first place, then you never get to the position where you can make further decisions, and you never actually are in a position to be able to determine whether something was as useful in practice as was indicated perhaps by the clinical trial data.
Anyone else? Richard, do you want to come back?
Yeah, well, just specifically on cystic fibrosis, because it does seem to me to be par excellence, this catch-22, because here's a specific drug. I don't know it. It's a completely new drug. But if it is specifically for the G551D group, presumably that's what the license says. Yes. So proving exceptionality in that case is absolutely impossible. So you've not got it approved. You can't apply under IPTR. We don't have a system where that drug can be used in Scotland, or do we?
Yes.
You know, I mean, you're absolutely right, because in our situation with ivacaftor, this drug was 100% beneficial to 100% of the cohort of patients, which again is very small. We were talking somewhere between 53 to 72 patients. Again, some patients might not be genotyped, so that's why we've not got an exact figure of, you know, because of data protection and everything. So this drug was 100% of the patients within the cohort, and who, you know, we couldn't prove exceptionality because we would have perhaps one child who was maybe more urgently required intervention, maybe through an IPTR, but who's to say that that patient would benefit the most? So it was a very difficult situation, because the patient who is perhaps healthier or appears healthier might in fact benefit most.
Professor Hillman.
I think this is true, but also many of the other rare diseases are genetic. PNH is genetic, glycogen storage diseases are genetic, and the therapies are specific for that genetic problem. So every patient with PNH has got the same genetic abnormality, and everyone responds to the therapy. So to pick out one disease and say this is different because it's, you know, so obviously targeted to that subgroup of patients is probably incorrect, because all the other diseases have largely genetic problems which are specifically treated.
Yes.
I think this comes down to the fact that in the current IPTR recommendations, it states that each health board has to bring in an expert, a recognised expert. And obviously, if the health board decides to bring in, for the example of PNH, if they decide to bring in a haematologist who's never met a PNH patient, then clearly their opinion will be less informed than a recognised PNH expert. And in Scotland, we have 30 PNH patients, and only 12 of those patients are actually recommended for the drug. Now, it's the reason that 12 are recommended is because we have consultants like Professor Hillman and Dr. Lindsay Mitchell at Monklands, which is the Scottish Centre of Excellence for PNH. They understand the drug, they understand the condition so well, they can say that for the 12 patients, it is 100% effective, the Soliris. The point that I really feel that we need to make is that where there's a Scottish Centre of Excellence for a condition, then that is where you need to find the expert opinion. You must seek the expert opinion there, because in my condition, 12 recommended for the drug out of 30, the difficult decision to decide who that will work for has already been done before it goes to an IPTR situation. So where there's a centre of excellence, that is where we need to find the expert.
Judge, you want to follow up?
No, that's very helpful.
Okay. Bob?
Yeah, I'm just curious about the new arrangements the Cabinet Secretary set up because of the interim findings of the review that the government's taken place. Are we looking at the IPTR methodology being amended to take into account, Ms Ferguson, in relation to what you were saying about patients suffering from one particular strand of CF? Has there been movement on that?
No, I think the IPTR system, and I mean, I'm not an expert on the IPTR system, but I think it maybe would work very well for the wider population, you know, for a much, you know, bigger population. But when it comes to rare diseases in particular, where you have got a small cohort of patients, I think they have to be taken out and dealt with in a separate situation and not through the IPTR. Something like a group IPTR kind of situation would be ideal, where you could take the whole cohort and deal with them as a group applying for that funding rather than individually, because again that must be a great waste of resources that now all these doctors are sitting down, they've got, you know, 18 different applications that they're trying to prove exceptionality on for each of their patients, you know, so even if they spend an hour and a half to 2 hours on each one, you're talking expert clinicians, you know, that's 36 to 40 hours, that's a full week's work just on 18 patients.
Is there a, sorry, what's going there?
I was just
yes, Professor Hall.
going to support Marion's point. Really. I think the way I would consider it is that if you have a more common disease, there may be 10 or 20 applications for IPTR, of which the committee then can look at the different merits for the patients, perhaps. But with a rare disease, there may only be one every 3 years for that committee. And so how does that committee then decide this patient's exceptional from the other 12 patients or 30 patients in the country? So I think that's a real issue for the IPTR.
Anyone else? Yeah, Dr. Roberts.
To echo the two comments of Professor Hellman and Mrs Ferguson in terms of what's happened with Pompe in Scotland. So initially 11 patients, 2 moved across to England to get treatment, leaving 9 patients. Of the 9 patients in Scotland, 2 are children, and even for those 2 children it was a battle to get the treatment. Of the 7 adults, 2 of those have been treated, so there's already mismatch between different health boards with some patients being treated. 1 patient comes to a clinical trial every 2 weeks, all the way to anything but sunny Salford to see me, and that leaves 5 patients without any treatment at all. So the current process, clearly, as Ms Ferguson has alluded to, of the IPTR system, doesn't, at least for this rare patient group, seem fit for purpose, and a more modified group approach with a very good evidence base being pursued, I absolutely agree, would seem a fairer process. And for example, in England, we're talking, as you'd hope, with the cost of these treatments, to treat a patient with Pompe, it does depend on body mass, but it can be up to £250,000 per patient per year. So they're eye-watering sums, but we are talking about stop criteria. That is, when the patients have had a good period of assessment on treatment, if it's clear that they are not as an individual benefiting, we may consider phasing out their treatment.
Is anyone else? Yes, certainly.
I'll just to echo that point, from the P&H perspective, we've had, from my recollection, 12 applications through the IPTR system in Scotland, and 9 have been approved and are currently on therapy, and 3 have not been approved, and the 3 that haven't been approved are all from the same health board. So there's a difference across Scotland regarding the way the IPTR process is effective or ineffective.
Yeah, I'm going to take the witnesses. I see committee members who want to get back in, either following on these questions or others. Bob hasn't finished his question, but I'm taking the witnesses in terms of their response. Mr. Kent.
Yes, thank you. Very briefly on this point, rather than using IPTRs as a gateway into accessing a particular therapy, I mean, an alternative following on from Mark's point, is I mean, a system which is operated in Australia and the Netherlands, where, in a sense, the presumption is that the drug will be licensed, but stop criteria are put in place. It's called coverage with evidence development. So, in a sense, you say, right, we don't know how effective this drug is. It looks like it's going to work on the basis of the clinical trials, and we will fund it for patients who need it for a period of however long it takes, depending on the nature of the condition. But those people who are allowed to prescribe and monitor this drug have an obligation to report according to a set of predetermined criteria, so that we can establish whether or not the particular intervention is as good as we thought. And that means you're not in the situation where individual health boards or funding authorities are forced to make decisions between apparently equally deserving patients based on where they live, but they are put under an obligation to generate the evidence which allows a proper decision to be made on the benefits of that real-world application of a therapy.
Leslie Lolliger.
I just wanted to sort of follow up to what Professor Hillman was saying, and say that the one thing that we really must have is equality between the health boards, because at the moment we don't with the IPTR system. Last Thursday I held my patient group at Monklands for the PNH patients. I had two patients sitting beside each other. One is a man who's on the drug and had taken the day off work to come for his appointment. The other is a woman who had to be brought in by her husband because she's so physically and emotionally ill with her condition. And the woman said to the man who's on the drug, "Why did you get the drug and I didn't?" And his answer was, "Oh, I'm not in your health board, so I was fine." So it's that concept that is between health boards is unfair. And again, that's where having a slightly different process and looking at it more centrally would take that away.
Bob?
Yeah. Can I ask a brief question about this idea of stopping treatment, and then I want to move on slightly further. But is it, I mean, can you ever perceive a situation in Scotland where you prescribe a drug to a cohort of 10 people, and then you make that choice, well, actually, for 5 of you it's not working, we're going to stop it? There'd be a heck of a hue and cry over that, wouldn't there? Do you think that's actually practical to do, or does it just sound like a good idea, but one in reality which wouldn't be workable?
I think it's something, obviously we spoke about Agnes and the advisory group and things, but I think it's something that's going to happen in England, definitely. There's no question that that's going to happen, and the clinicians have got to give evidence that the drug is working for these patients on a limited time scale. So I can't see that it couldn't work, the same system in Scotland.
Mr. Kent and Professor Hillman.
I mean, it's what happens in medicine. I mean, patients get taken off medicines all the time, whether they're rare or common. The issue is, in terms of some of the drugs we're talking about, being clear that the criteria to evaluate whether or not a particular intervention is effective takes account of the experience and the views of the patients as to the salience of various elements of the condition to the quality and the quantity of their life. You know, some things with some conditions, you know, they're a nuisance, but you can manage them. Other things really screw up your ability to enjoy a reasonably normal quality of life. And so long as the appraisal process for effectiveness takes account of those things which are seen to be important by the patients in terms of their the effectiveness of the intervention, then there's no reason why a transparent process shouldn't work in practice. Because, you know, patients, we have no interest in taking things that don't work, but we do have an interest in accessing things that will change our lives for the better. So the important thing is making sure that if you're going to have this kind of coverage with evidence development scheme, that the endpoints are clear and accepted by all the stakeholders.
Professor Hillman?
I was just going to answer your question to some extent. I think the two issues, first of all, the issue of whether the drug is really effective and whether you stop it because it's not effective. And I think with these diseases, I don't know of a case where it hasn't been shown to be effective in the long term when it's been effective in the short term. So I think the answer to your question in that situation is, well, it works, so you wouldn't want to stop it. I think we'll probably discuss this a little later on, I guess, that the role of the expert service is critical, because we've stopped and we plan to stop some patients on eculizumab with PNH. For example, we had a lady in Scotland who was pregnant and she got her treatment through the pregnancy and stopped 3 months afterwards because we know that's the best way to manage her. Now, we've got more experience than anybody else in the world about managing pregnancy in PNH, and it's a very complex issue. We've stopped 2 or 3 patients in England because their disease got better with PNH, and you've got, the expert service can do that. So we do look at patients individually and we treat them appropriately. We've got no interest in treating people with drugs that are really not really the expense, even the risk of having therapy, IV therapy every 2 weeks with risk of infection is not something we want to expose our patients to if it's not working.
Just a clear intervention here, because I have got 2 committee members.
No, it's just the request to maybe look at a group of small numbers on their own and take them out the individual as an individual application. Would that not have the danger of excluding that whole group and no redress for individuals? I mean, although I hear all the flaws in regard, and I think we should pay attention to them, but at least some people are benefiting that provides evidence. But if you're going to exclude, if someone or a committee made a decision on the whole group, I'd be very uncomfortable about that. So I wonder if anyone could maybe help me and explain what their views are on that.
Actually, if we were to do that kind of system, I don't think it would exclude you then from coming back and saying, well, actually, I'm different from that cohort and I want to make an IPTR. So I think, there's room for both systems.
Okay, Bob, did you want to pursue?
Really, well, I'm going to try and be brief, convener, but just in terms of the stop treatment and the evidence base around that, I would just have to put on record, of course, it's not about whether a pharmaceutical intervention works, it's to the degree of which it works and how it impacts on the quality and what the modifiers are on it. So I don't think it's enough to say if we treat someone and it works a bit, we keep on using that intervention. So I don't think it's as straightforward as maybe the discussion we've had around here, but I do want to put that on the record in terms of some of the concerns I had with that, but I'll be interested to see what does happen in England. What I was more concerned about, convener, was the idea that the 14 health boards have are interpreting current systems differently, and that's not acceptable. Yes, they're entitled to make their own informed decision, but if they're interpreting the guidelines differently, that would not be acceptable. And one of the questions I asked the previous panel was, yes, we can get all 14 health boards to be more aligned to how they interpret the information, but it would be easier to align less than 14. In other words, would less than 14 be helpful? Not health boards, ADTCs that would be looking at these.
Yes.
I think you just need to change the wording so that it clearly states who you're going to ask for the expert opinion. I think for me that getting the right wording in the guidelines it wouldn't really matter then how many divisions there are.
So 14 teams would be okay.
Okay. I'm not sure that it's a very efficient way of, as I mentioned before, these teams might be seeing, certainly for the smaller health boards, may have never seen an application for an ultra-orphan disease, and I think it's very difficult for them to then judge it. I think the effective way of this is to have a single entity like the NSD, for example, because we've worked with the NSD, who sort of oversees the application of the use of a therapy in a certain disease. That's not necessarily a funding issue, but I think the expertise is important. The differences between the IPTR processes within the health boards, and I've not been permitted to go to the IPTR processes, although we've supported the local haematologists in generating the evidence. is hard to understand without having been through the process, but they take the same evidence for patients with the same disease and come with completely different decisions. And then the appeal process, our experience of the appeal process has been very difficult. I mean, our patients are so ill, they can't go and represent themselves in a committee like this. I mean, they're lucky to get to the clinic if the husband or wife carries them in. So to come to this sort of committee and argue their case is impossible.
Thank you. Anyone else? Is that a supplementary? No. Okay, I'll come back. We'll have yes.
We were talking about the 14 health boards. I think that is a very good point, that perhaps 14 different health boards is too many. In my own case with my son, he attends hospital in Glasgow, so therefore it would be Glasgow Health Board that would make his application. We live in Lanarkshire, so it would then have to come back to Lanarkshire as well. So it is very roundabout. I think if there was something more centralised or less, especially for specialised rare diseases, then it would make it a much simpler process than going round and then back to Lanarkshire, who they don't have a specialist in this particular area, so it would then still have to rely on Glasgow to make the decision. And ultimately, NSD in Edinburgh are funding it with this Rare Medicines Fund, so it's going through a lot of loops which possibly could be cut out with reducing the size of people making that decision for that particular thing.
I've got Nanette, and then Mark, and I think Richard wants back in, but Nanette, no one.
Yes, it's just, I mean, we know of the plans to move to a value-based pricing system, and I admit we haven't had very much detail on that so far. But does the panel have any views on the possible effects this might have on the appraisal system in Scotland? Or is it too early to...
Obviously, we don't know what the details are. I mean, but the fact of taking into account these cost offsets is absolutely essential. So whatever the form is, it's absolutely essential to take into account things like, from my own personal experience, I no longer require blood transfusions every 6 weeks. I don't face the possibility of kidney dialysis. All these things, I mean, for other conditions, as things like plasma exchange, all these kind of things that cost so much, it's absolutely essential that we have it. We just need the details.
Anyone else on that? Dr. Roberts?
And very much we don't know what these things will involve, because I think we'd all feel strongly that a sort of quality-based assessment wouldn't work for rare conditions where the treatments inherently, because of the development costs, are going to be expensive. So I think it's important to have a very thorough socioeconomic model. For example, many patients with Pompe disease are unable to work because of their disability. If they had an intervention earlier, they could generate income as well as well-being for themselves. So I think all of those things need to be factors in. And in addition, of course, particularly with conditions which could require acute hospital interventions, for example, ventilation, if you could treat earlier and delay that period or requirement for ventilation, there might be hidden benefits. I appreciate that's always a difficult argument, spending money to save money, but there might be some validity with these rare diseases.
Mr. Kent.
Yes, I mean, I think the rhetoric about value-based pricing is obviously one that is superficially attractive. I mean, clearly, if something delivers value, maybe it ought to be able to attract a higher price in a commercially focused environment. But I think in terms of the negotiations that have been going on between the UK government and the pharmaceutical industry, there seems to have been a kind of, whatever the absence, the opposite of transparency introduced into the process. There is a kind of a miasma that's sprung up around this whole issue. And it's not that, you know, as a patient representative, I want to have a say in the price of a drug. That's a commercial decision taken by the company as to what it seeks to charge for its product. But I do want to have a say in terms of the value of that drug to me and people like me who are patients. And part of the problem, I think, that we see with this whole rhetoric around value-based pricing is that it has proved singularly difficult to engage in the negotiations about the elements that will determine the value of a drug. And the fear is that there will be a very simplistic definition of value adopted, partly because of the speed of the process. It's got to be negotiated, agreed, and up and running in time to be implemented from the 1st of January 2014, which is 11 months away. Partly because of the confusion between value and price and the commercial nature of the discussions that are going on between the ABPI and the Department of Health. And partly because I think, there has been some very simplistic interpretation of some very complicated or potentially complicated issues. I mean, how do you judge the relative value of a drug which will give a child with a formerly life-limiting condition a normal life expectancy compared with the value of something that will add a few extra months to a terminal patient with cancer and put them through the same mill? And I think the fear from many patients is that we will be excluded from the discussions around value, and the elements that make up the calculation of that value of that particular intervention will be made on the basis of an oversimplistic model because of the necessity to achieve a result by the demands of the legislation that's been enacted.
Professor Hillman.
Just to support that and give an example of which there are many. I mean, the young patient with 2 children who's disabled and the effect that has on the family, on the children's upbringing, because the mother or father can't participate in their care, and in fact becomes the cared person for rather than the carer, is much wider than whether you have dialysis or other medical interventions. So the great concern, I think, as Alistair points out, is that you're not going to take on the wider aspects of the effect of treating this patient very effectively. The advantage that these drugs have for value-based pricing is that it works for everybody. So whereas other drugs might work for 10% of patients, and therefore value becomes the 90% there's no benefit. In these drugs, it does benefit everybody, although, as you mentioned, it might be some people are more severely affected, and therefore it benefits them better. But, so I think that's important.
Yeah,
it's fine. Thank you.
Mark.
Yeah, Convener. A couple of the questions I was thinking of have gone already, but I guess one of the concerns I had at the start of this inquiry, or certainly when I joined this inquiry, was that we would find ourselves in a situation where illness was being pitted against illness, if you will, and different groups would be saying that they had a more deserving call on funding. And luckily, I don't think we've got to that stage. But I do wonder, in terms of rare conditions, one of the concerns I've had for a long time is that often in health-related issues, the attention goes towards those who perhaps have the numbers behind them, be that in terms of individuals who have a condition, be that in terms of lobbying organisations who have the ability to put cases across publicly. And I just wonder, in terms of when decisions are being taken, if there is a concern that what we have in the case of rare conditions are, because we have such small numbers of individuals who are affected, is there a concern that there is not enough of a voice there to advocate publicly on behalf of these individuals, and that they often are not the people who are being first thought about? I mean, if we look, for example, there is the example of the Cancer Drug Fund, for example, that exists south of the border. Some would argue that that is putting cancer above other conditions, largely off the back of very successful lobbying efforts by cancer charities and other organisations. Do we have a situation, maybe not just in Scotland but elsewhere, that rare conditions are simply not being given the level of exposure, as it will, in order to allow for decision makers to take appropriate decisions in favour of those conditions?
Dr. Roberts.
Well, I think I think all your points are well taken, and I think many people working in the rare disease field would feel, and very appropriately, that cancer and cardiovascular disease are prioritised given the frequency of those conditions. And a concern, therefore, that by inadvertent default, to be fair, that the rare diseases may become disadvantaged. And I think the very fact that this committee is looking into these issues bodes extremely well, because it is a concern we have, and I think there is a need for greater representation. But there are practical problems. You know, the number of patients is small. You know, the number of members of a charity are intrinsically small, and it makes them, therefore, as a lobbying group, a relatively potentially weak group. And that's why Alistair Kent and other groups are so important in bringing together these rare diseases. Almost we need a champion, a czar, for rare disease management, really. Would you like to comment on that, Mr. Kent? If I might be allowed to ask the question to another member through the convener.
I'm second in line, I think. Professor Hillman had his hand up first.
I agree entirely. I think the process, this process, is evidence that the rare diseases have been taken seriously, and those of us who have been involved in rare diseases for many years have not had this sort of access, and patients have not had in some health communities, any real voice. Even the patient group hasn't been able to access the sort of committees that make the decisions. I think the thing I would highlight is that we're focusing very much on drugs here and cost of drugs, but you can't underplay the importance of specialist services, because the patient needs to understand their disease, needs to know that they're getting the best advice. And sometimes the therapy isn't a drug, it's physiotherapy, or it's some other surgery, in fact. So I think it needs to be looked at as a whole service to get the best treatment for the patients in Scotland.
Mr. Kent.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm flattered by the recognition. Thank you. I think that there are a number of points that I want to make in response to your question, Mr. MacDonald. Yes, there is a risk that the absence of advocacy may prejudice the effectiveness of the case that can be made for a particular intervention. And clearly, patient support organisations vary in their effectiveness. I mean, I'm very fortunate in the sense that it is my job to make myself available to you. So I don't have to take time off work to be here, or to go to represent and support a patient making a case for a particular intervention. Many of our 156 member groups are made up entirely of volunteers. And if they do need to support one of their families going to seek a particular intervention, then that's done at some personal cost, financial cost, personal cost, whatever, because they have to take a day off work. They have to make arrangements for their own children to be looked after if they have any, or for the person they're caring for to be looked after. So there are institutional barriers for people who are directly affected making an effective case, and we need to find ways of reducing or eliminating those barriers so that patients and families who have very rare conditions, where support groups exist that are made up entirely of people who have those conditions or caring for those conditions, are enabled to have their say to the committees and the powers that be. And I think the importance of that advocacy is growing. And I think, given the direction in which biological research is taking us, which is, you know, increasingly fragmentation of common conditions into rare conditions because of genetically distinct subsets of those conditions, increasing recognition of the relationship between some very rare conditions and the biological processes underpinning some more complex conditions. That patient-led advocacy in terms of making the case is going to become an ever-increasing factor in terms of enabling policymakers, planners, people who have to make the resource allocation decisions, understand the totality of the situation around which they are deciding. But I think also we need to be careful because, I would never argue against seeking the patient perspective. I think having that patient and end user perspective, the knowledge of the impact of the condition on the lives of those who are affected by it, is absolutely fundamental to a fair decision-making process. But in the previous session, a question was asked, I think it was you, Mr. Doris, who asked the question about individual patient input to IPTR requests. And yes, there absolutely should be the opportunity for patients to make that case about the impact of their condition. But we need to be hugely careful that we don't put patients in the position of being the supplicant before the committee, beseeching the committee to grant them their treatment. The treatment should be there as a matter of right, as a matter of good medicine, as a matter of good practice, not because somebody happens to be able to make a case that melts the heart of the committee and so they become an exception. So patient advocacy, patient evidence, patient input is central to this process. Making people beg for their own therapy would be a completely retrograde step and we shouldn't permit it.
Mark?
I take on board the point, and certainly when I was talking about advocacy, that wasn't necessarily
I wasn't suggesting you were. I wasn't for a minute suggesting you were, but I wanted to make sure that was my point.
An interesting point to follow up, though, Convener. Professor Hillman touched on the issue around specialism, and obviously there is a difficulty in the sense that because you are dealing with conditions which have such small patient numbers, there's an issue around how specialised an individual clinician can be. Also in terms of the geographical situation, which I think Mrs. Ferguson highlighted very eloquently about the problems of having to cross health board areas sometimes to access specialism, and I and I'm sure others have dealt with constituents who have that problem as well. I guess it's about ensuring continuity going forward, because while there may be specialists now, obviously they're not going to be there forever because they will eventually retire from practice. And are we confident that there is enough information available out there? And I guess this follows on from the point I was making, is that if you don't have the information as publicly available around some of these rare conditions, can we be confident that there are those coming through the system now who are going to be saying as a career choice, I quite fancy specialising in that particular rare condition, and ensuring that the patients of the future are going to have specialist clinicians who are able to not only offer treatment but also to offer advocacy on their behalf?
Yes, Professor Hillman.
I can speak from my own experience of this. I mean, the English system with the National Commissioning Group, or Agnes, as part of Agnes, funds services, not drugs. And so we have specialists funded and specialist nurses and support staff funded through that process, which for the size of England and the number of patients is a small cost compared to the drug costs that we use, but gives us a complete independence and we're able to manage the patients appropriately, whether they're need that therapy or need other supportive treatments. It also allows us to there's 3 parts of haematologists who are specialists, so they're not necessarily only managing their rare disease, but we see 250 patients with PNH, of which only 120 are on treatment across England and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. So we do have that process. In Scotland, we've supported the haematologist in the clinic in Monklands, who's now in her own right an expert in PNH and seeing all the Scottish patients. So you can work out models which, I don't know, if Lindsay was away, the English consultants are around to give support. So we can support the service in that way. So I think it's very, very important that not just consultants, the nurses are also pivotal in this process, that our nurses educate patients, the home care we give, etc. And so it's a service, not just 1 or 2 consultants. And it adds a huge amount of value to a service and to the effective use of these therapies.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Kent, go on.
Yeah, you raise, I think, a hugely important point in terms of sustainability. And there have been examples of services that were founded by enthusiastic practitioners which have provided a very valuable support to a particular group of patients. But when that practitioner you know, died or moved on or whatever, the service withered on the vine. And I think the sort of developments that are being encouraged through the European Commission and the EU Committee of Experts on Rare Diseases around centres of expertise and the clustering of similar groups of rare diseases in order to enable the critical mass of expertise to be put together, because there is the volume of patients coming through. And that in itself allows for the perpetuation of research, because there's a volume of patients to make research easier. It does attract interested clinicians into careers in the field that makes it sustainable. And it allows for the economically efficient and effective use of expertise and resources, because that expertise, those resources, are used to full capacity rather than, you know, standing idle for some of the time because there isn't the volume coming through. So I think by designating particular centres of expertise, you can address that particular issue. And I think also by making sure, as with the example that we've heard from the professor here, of, you know, arm's length support for expertise through professional networks, you can make sure that local Scottish centres of expertise are plugged into the forefront of UK-wide and European global thinking about what constitutes good and effective practice for that particular cluster of rare diseases.
So any other members get any questions at this point? Richard?
Yes. It's really leading on from something Professor Hillman was saying earlier on. It seems to me that we do think of the drugs as separate from the services, and yet the drugs are an integral part of the services. And I just wonder if we've got the model wrong for the rare diseases completely, that it should be looking at the service as a whole, because we've got a National Services Division in Scotland, we've got Agnes in England, or, you know, the system in England for funding, and maybe we actually need to think of it in a slightly different, having a slightly different approach. The other part of that is we do have a system of reinsurance in Scotland, and I'm not sure if it operates across the whole UK for very rare diseases. But in Scotland, you know, rather than one health board funding a Pompe case, for example, it's reinsured at a Scottish level or a UK level. You know, I wonder if we've got that right in terms of Scotland, UK, and Europe, indeed, depending on the rarity of the condition, because there are some conditions, there are only half a dozen cases in the whole of Europe. Yeah. So, you know, do we need to have discussions to have a better system that takes it out of our 14 different drug and therapeutics committees who cannot have the expertise in most of these conditions, and recognise that, you know, for some we'll deal with it in Scotland if the numbers are big enough. For some we actually need to reinsure at a UK level, and the decision should be made there as to who should get the, you know, through the service. I'm just thinking on my feet here and just wonder if...
Comment about that, Professor Hillman?
I agree entirely, obviously, from my previous points that I've made. The two issues of the drug and the service are not necessarily entwined into one. So I think if a drug is going to be funded, you need to make sure that the national services here are able to cope with that in an appropriate way. In diseases where, as Leslie pointed out before, with PNH, 2/3 of the patients don't need therapy but need support and may need other interventions which are delivered locally, it's very important those patients can access the service rather than just because they're on the drug they can access an expert service. I think the model can be different between diseases. I think the role of the National Services Division here or the National Commissioning Group in the UK is very, very important, that the risk sharing across health boards and the husbandry, if that's the right word, of a service by a government committee such as the NSD is a very effective way of managing a rare disease service. And England is unlike almost any other country in the world, and I've been advised a number of countries about approval: Australia, Canada, the Netherlands. And this is to fund the service, I think, is very important, and actually I think makes commercial sense because it's a relatively small amount of money compared to the drug.
Dr Roberts and then Mr Kent.
I very much echo the comments about the need for centres of excellence to develop the service for patients as well as drugs. And by services, I mean cardiac support, I mean physiotherapy, all these things that are vital. But these patients are coming a long way. And so I think the main role of the centres is to provide direction with regard to those services and then work with the local services. So although those elements are just as important as the drugs often, it is the drug cost that falls on the centres and needs to be centrally funded in some mechanism. I certainly can't speak on the financial risk sharing scheme and what would be the best model, but I could well understand that individual health boards faced with, for example, 4 Pompe patients, as affects one health board in Scotland, might feel that they had a very difficult financial dilemma compared to other health boards in Scotland, and that is inequitous to them. And so some mechanism, either at a national or even UK level, needs to be thought through.
Mr Kent.
Yes, I think from a patient, from a family perspective, what's needed is a sense of what it can reasonably be expected that the NHS will provide. You know, what constitutes good practice that reflects current scientific understanding and current clinical possibility. If that includes a drug, then that drug should be seen as being part of the service, not a bolt-on bit that is added, you know, if you can get it through your health board. That way, patients and families have a clear expectation about, you know, their interaction, their relationship with the health service, but also with other funding agents, you know, with health and social care and other services. I think to separate out the drug as being somehow different and in a different pot puts uncertainty into patient expectation, leads to anxiety, and also leads to a disproportionate risk that silo budgeting will creep in. Because, you know, if you can identify this one little pot that's got the drug in it, and then these other little pots that contribute elements of service to the patient and family experience, then those people responsible for administering those separate pots, if under financial pressure, will be tempted into the line of, well, why should I spend my money here on this patient? But if it's because my budget's under pressure. But if you have an integrated view across that nationally commissioned, locally commissioned, integrated provision, then, and across from health to social care and so on, then in fact there is a positive incentive to do the best you can for the patient rather than simply in a short-term way to make sure that your budget balances at the end of the financial year.
Yes, of
I was just going to say, from a patient perspective, having a centre of excellence for a condition is absolutely imperative. Patients will come into my patient group. Those that have been told they're not eligible for the drug by one of the experts, they're fine with that because they have that level of trust there and they accept it. The ones that are told that they can't get the drug because it's down to whether they're lucky enough to get it based on the financials, they are not happy, they're very upset, they find that very depressing. So there's a trust, a magnificent trust that's built up within a centre of excellence that gives patients sort of some security.
May I further point?
I just want to clarify my previous statement in light of the further comments. I very firmly believe that the role of the specialist centre is to work with the local specialist, the local haematologist in my case, and we share care very much with local haematologists around the country. And so I don't want to be considered to be thinking we're trying to take over the patients. We're not. We're supporting the patients and the service.
Yeah, that's helpful. Is there any other questions? Certainly come back. Yeah.
Just going on back to where you were talking about the medicines being maybe lumped in with the same as the services. For our particular condition, we are a subgroup of a larger population of cystic fibrosis patients. I, for one, wouldn't support that should be put into the pot, because then you would have clinicians or indeed managers having to decide, well, I've got this patient that requires this, but I've got G551D patient here that doesn't, well, I'll not give them their medicine because I can, and that wouldn't really be fair, because our subgroup is within a much larger group.
Okay.
Sorry, so I would like to see that money for the drug ring-fenced, which sort of goes against what you're saying, Mr. Kent.
I think sorry, just to come back on that, I think it's about defining what constitutes a good quality service. Now, you know, in your particular case, you have a very clear indication that a good quality service should include access to the appropriate medication. And I think if there is that service specification, then it wouldn't be a matter of robbing Peter to pay Paul within a disease group. There would be the opportunity to make that kind of nuanced discussion and to state, you know, this is what is clinically possible, this is what is clinical good practice, this is what is reflected by our current scientific understanding, and this is what responds to the patient needs. So it's not about playing off subsets of a population, it's about making sure that there is a shared understanding of what it is reasonable to be expected for patients who fall within defined groups in terms of what's appropriate and feasible.
Okay, I don't think I've got any other questions from committee members. And at this point, I appreciate your attendance here, of course, but there may have been issues that you don't feel have been covered, or an important point that you intended to make and that you wish to put on the record at this point, or indeed in the travel away from here, as often happens. Oh, I wish I had said that. You've still got that opportunity anyway in terms of the interaction with the committee through the clerks, and if you feel that you would want to add anything or give us any submission for further consideration, then obviously feel free to do that. But at this point, do any of our witnesses wish to make brief points on any areas that they feel it's important that the committee take into consideration? Professor Hillman.
Just we briefly discussed the fund, the £21 million for rare diseases fund, and I first of all say that I think that's a very welcome recognition of rare diseases, but the clarity is going to be in how that's administered, and we've already highlighted the difficulties for rare disease to access that funding, and the way it's worded at the moment, the patients who get funded through the IPTR anyway would have access to that funding. So is it really additional money, or is it just rebadging the money that's already being spent on rare diseases?
Yeah, these are obviously questions that the committee are also interested in, and we will seek opportunities for that clarification. Indeed, as the review and the results of the review and access to medicines and the IPTR become clearer, then obviously we hope that there's well, we're planning for an engagement to get that clarity. So we hope that we can, I'm sure that we will retain your attention, and you'll be observing those developments very closely. And we welcome your support in that process. If there are no other questions, it just remains for me to thank you all on behalf of the committee for your attendance here and the evidence that have been provided, and we appreciate it very much. Thank you all once again for your attendance here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you.
We now move to agenda item number 2, which is consideration of subordinate legislation. The first instrument for consideration today is the Journal Pharmaceutical Council Amendment, Miscellaneous Provisions, Rules Order of Council 2012 S1 2012 3171. And as members have seen from a note of the papers, this is a UK statutory instrument that is subject to the annulment by resolution of either the UK Houses of Parliament or by the Scottish Parliament. This is unusual, but the procedure here is the same as it is normally would be for an SSI. Can I invite comments from the members? I know there's no comments. I will proceed. The question is that the Journal Pharmaceutical Council, as laid out in the paper, that the committee has no recommendations to make. Are we agreed? Thank you. We now move to the second item of subordinate legislation before the committee. Today, the Sports Grounds and Sporting Events Designation Scotland Amendment Order 2013 SSI 213. And can I invite comments from the members? I know there's no comment from the members. The question is that the Sports Grounds and Sporting Events, as laid before you, that the committee has no recommendations to make. Are we all agreed? Thank you. That is agreed. We now move to agenda item number 3, which is the European priorities. And we have in our papers a paper prepared by the clerks of the European reporter Aileen MacLeod, who of course isn't with us today, but you've got the paper, and I invite comments from the members.
I suppose just to thank Aileen for her input and taking the role of European reporter. I'm particularly keen to see active and healthy ageing on the agenda. I know it's something, having attended a conference in Canada, I know it's something the European Commission are doing a lot of work on, and I think there's obviously relevant issues to explore within this committee, so I would support that.
The basic decision we have, I think, is to agree the priority topics suggested by Aileen as our European reporter, which is the e-Health Action Plan 2012-20 and has been referred to the EIP on active and healthy ageing. We also need to consider, it's not either or here, but I suppose that we would monitor the UK government's review of balance of competencies and ascertain how the Scottish Government intends to respond before considering our own report, or keep under review any developments concerning the two main priorities from 2012. The revision of Tobacco Products Directive and the package of innovation in health medical devices. Are there any comments on that? So we would agree with the options as laid out? Can I have the committee's agreement on that? Yes. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Is this another item on the... no, that concludes our meeting for the day. Thank you very much again for your participation and patience.